everyone. Welcome to today's panel on translating multilingualism. And thank you so much to BCLT for inviting us and hosting today's discussion. Madhu, Lucia, Hamid, would you mind putting your videos on? So I'm joined by this amazing panel today. So we have Lucia Colichon, who is a Brazilian-German translator and PhD candidate in translation studies at Warwick University. We have Madhu Kaza, who is a writer, translator, artist, and educator based in New York City. And we have Hamid Roslan, who is a writer and the author of Past Tree, Forest, Fire, which was published by Ethos Books in 2019. And more detailed bios of them can be found on the event page. My name is Gitanjali Patel, and I'm a PhD researcher at University of Birmingham and also director of an organization called Shadow Heroes, which supports young people in embracing all sides of their linguistic and cultural heritages through creative translation workshops. So a couple of housekeeping things. I think Anna mentioned on the chat that the chat function is available for people to chat, and then the Q&A function is a separate thing for if anyone has any questions. Closed captions are on, so you can either switch them on or switch them off if you need them. And the session will be recorded, and after the summer school, it will be available on the BCLT YouTube channel. Okay, so multilingualism and translating multilingualism is a super fascinating topic, and also one that I feel deserves considered interrogation. And so I sort of want to start by talking about how in the US and the UK, translation is traditionally conceived of a process that starts in a more or less definable source language and then travels across to a more or less definable target language. And within this ideological framework, language becomes this bounded entity which has apparently definable characteristics. So we'll have a text which will say this is a text that is written in Spanish from Galicia, or this is a text that is written in Turkish from Istanbul, and we're then going to translate it into English from England. But of course, the reality is much more fluid and complex than that. I mean, so outside of translation, would we really assume that everyone in Istanbul, for example, uses the same version of Turkish, or that everyone just uses Turkish and no other language? And would we really assume that every English reader uses the same version of English? Yet there is this heavy reliance on traditional conceptions of language and translation, and that we see these through classic metaphors such as the bridge between two distinct cultures, or the container metaphor where a language is the container of a culture. And we see how they extend to beliefs about language users, where we have constructs such as the native speaker, the first language speaker. And all of these are rooted in monolingual ideologies of language and translation, which undermine multilingual experiences and practices. And this is something that's been explored and challenged by all three of our speakers in different ways. So I'd like to start off by asking each of you how you think about multilingualism and translating multilingualism. Maybe should we start with Hamid?
Sure, I can kick us off. I think for me, multilingualism for me has evolved over time to sort of, the way I think about it is, what is my relationship to the languages that I know, the ones that I don't know, and also the ones that I wish I knew more of. So that's sort of how I've conceptualized for myself what multilingualism means for me. And I say this because I come from Singapore. And in Singapore, multilingualism is sort of like a principle that's quite enshrined, and it is structured in precisely the way in which you've explained it, Gitanjali, where there are 4 official languages in Singapore: English, Malay, Chinese, and Tamil. There is a kind of languages abounded, and so translation sort of becomes that tool by which we explain ourselves to each other. The languages that the native tongue is so-called a carrier of cultural values. And English becomes this bridging language, a so-called politically neutral language. And we all know this is not true at all. And so that's kind of the idea of multilingualism that I grew up with. But over time, I've sort of begun seeing multilingualism as being a lot more messy, and also a space in which languages can be allowed to cross-pollinate, to trouble one another, and to also exist in a register that might occupy something that's, between comprehensibility and something that's slightly more incomprehensible. We can use that word in scare quotes. Yeah.
Love that. Madhu?
Well, good morning, everyone. I appreciate so much just what Hamid just said. The question of what is my relationship to the languages I know, don't know, want to know, that is actually really, I think, very rich, because I think when I think of multilingualism, I think it's just actually our state of being. Like that is the original condition, is multiple, and it's not we start with one and then we get two. And it's also, to me, it's not we start with one and then we get three, and so I think just the question of boundaries, it's like, I think we exist in overlapping like language systems. And a lot of the current kind of thinking I'm doing around this has to do with thinking about ecology, thinking about the connections of ecology and translation and the ways in which, beings exist outside of certain, borders of nation states, or even linguistic kind of demarcations. So I think that on the one hand, I can say that as an immigrant and someone who lives in New York City, which is extremely multilingual, that I experience the collision of multiple languages all the time. But I think it's not only the status of being an immigrant. I think that even were I not to have immigrated, so in India, which we know is a place of so many languages, hundreds, thousands of languages, there's still this idea of like these borders of like linguistic states, but I think that what happens is even within any language, there are always the influences of other languages. And what's interesting to me is also the fact that we don't even know really the language that we speak. Like we think, like I might think that I'm Telugu, which is my first language, is a language distinct from all these other languages. But Telugu has Persian in it. It has Sanskrit in it. It has, other English in it, right? And so I might think of, my language as one thing, but it's actually always already multiple.
Yeah, thanks for that. There's lots of things that I want to pick up on, but first, Lucia.
Hello, everyone. Sorry for my voice. I got COVID, so I'm here in spite of all this because I couldn't miss this chat. I'm, as Gitanjali said, I'm Brazilian and German. So Brazil usually is not thought of as being necessarily super multilingual compared to compared to India, Singapore, obviously. But my upbringing, well, my mom's mother tongue was German. She was born and raised in Brazil. Only had to start learning Portuguese at the age of 10. So for my mom, Portuguese was a second language, and she didn't raise me with German, so I'm not a bilingual from birth German Portuguese speaker. So I had that growing up. And my dad's side of the family, I had my grandma who's a speaker of Spanish and Paraguayan Guarani, an indigenous language. So I had that from both sides, and yet I still thought of myself as, I'm pretty monolingual, My L1 is Portuguese. There's no question about that. But then we start challenging these things when I started learning other languages in a more official way, as these bounded entities. Like I had learned at uni, and they're like English UK, English US. That's what we got. And then you start learning about other Englishes and about other many variants and the way. And then when I came here to the UK, starting to study L2 translation, and going deeper into theories of translation and multilingualism to see, well, there are multilingual people translating, and then when they get to hear a norm such as you should translate into your first language, a lot of people might ask themselves, well, what is my first language? And why can't I translate into English even, so I started getting in touch with all of these things. So my experience with having different languages around me and being interested in learning different languages was always I always wanted to be able to communicate in that language. I didn't care about being grammatically correct, about being accurate or anything. My main goal in all the languages I learned was to be able to communicate, and I wanted to for people who make the effort to learn Portuguese to speak to me. I wanted to make a similar effort to speak to them in whatever language they speak. So I'm just one person. I cannot learn all the languages in the world, but we slowly start learning about how multilingualism is not only about having I know German, Portuguese, Spanish, English, whatever, like these like languages with a capital L, but about incorporating the fact that you have other languages in your daily life. And I've been doing this in my life and in my research, trying to not hide the fact that the person who's writing this or the person who's speaking to you right now, English is doesn't come naturally to me, or didn't a few years ago. So that's my experience. I guess I have more to say from the point of view of my research and theories and stuff. But I also have this weirdly monolingual / multilingual background that kind of informs my choices. And I think that's what I have to say for now.
Thanks, all three of you. I think this set us up really well for this discussion, because what's coming out of all three of what you said is this sort of messiness, this experience that can't be easily defined, that also is very sort of contextual, very personal. This question of boundaries keeps coming up. We are almost imposing boundaries on something that cannot be bounded, and that is coming through from what you're saying about what the experience is of multilingualism. And so when we think about translating multilingualism, to what extent do you think that we still rely on some of these boundaries? I suppose what I'm thinking is there something about the form of translation that's sort of trying to impose order on something that can't really be ordered? Whoever would like to.
I think I promise I wouldn't talk much because of my disease, but I do like to talk, so I'm gonna just say, I think the fact that if you're talking about literary translation, if you think about as being like a printed book, the fact that languages had to be standardized to fit into some kind of system so that they could be easily sellable, like they could become a commodity made for that, the press for standardization. And when someone comes and says, well, the system wants you to define what language is this book in. After all, it's translated from A language to B language. And then if you say, oh, well, there's more to it, it's not that simple, it complicates the system that wants things to be more easy, I say. Like, so I guess, so when multilingualism kind of complicates this idea that it's from A to B, that these languages are easily standardized, and then so to break that idea and also to make it visible that this is a translation, in a way, it's also a way that multilingualism breaks with the kind of the expectation that you have when you pick up a book, or it depends on the audience as well. But you pick up a book and you're assuming that you're reading the author. A lot of people just forget that there's a translator there. And then when multilingualism breaks that expectation, people get confused, or people get like, so I guess it's also about changing the expectation of the reader and the expectation of the market we're so multilingualism is kind of problematic for those who want to keep things as they are. So and translation kind of also, if you put multilingualism in translation, it kind of breaks that expectation that you have, that you're reading that author.
Madhu and Hamid, you both sort of you both explore this in Past Tree, Forest Fire and Kitchen Table's translations. It would be great to hear what you think.
I can chime in here a little bit. I have so many branching thoughts. So I think that one of the things that's coming to my mind, around boundaries is I think a boundary is not the problem. It's our relation to boundaries. It's the idea that how we view a boundary as a fixed and permanent and natural thing. I think any text that we translate, we are temporarily making a boundary, right? Here's the text, I'm fixing it for a moment. But thinking of it that way as part of a continuum, as a kind of gesture and kind of like ongoingness. To me, I'm thinking a lot about like the ongoingness of language or languages. And I think part of the problem of like source and target is this idea of, again, that there's a fixed thing that's the original and then becomes a fixed thing that's a translation. And I think that's where, again, like multiplicity really comes in, and that kind of messing with that notion. And I'm going to say something that's like way out there and maybe not useful because I don't have this isn't super thought out, but one of the things that's coming to my mind is actually, so it's like this question of the larger culture and how we view texts and translations, right? So the thing that's coming to my mind is copyright law. And so I don't have this precise, so please don't, no one quote me on this, but, I believe, copyright laws first came into effect in England in around 1790 or so. And I think, in the early 1800s came into effect in the United States. I happen to have recently read that copyright law came into effect in India, for instance, in around 1959. I think there's something interesting in that kind of trajectory in terms of colonization, and whatever we call like modernity, and the idea of a text being fixed, and a text being property and owned. And I know this opens up a lot of challenging questions around like translators as laborers and acknowledgement of translators. So, it's a tricky and messy thing, but I mentioned this just because I think that the idea of property is enclosure, right? And it's about enclosing. So if I have permission to translate a text and now it's fixed in my translation, what room is there for the ongoingness of that text, and how long does it take for it to open up for other people to make their intervention? So that's a big thing I just threw in there, but something I wanted to mention.
I love the phrase, the ongoingness of language. And I just wanted to add to that and talk about a couple of other things as well. First of all, being the myth of the perfect multilingual speaker or the myth of the perfect bilingual speaker is so strong in our minds that there's almost like a sense of shame every time you feel like as if, oh, I know one language better than the other, or the relationships between the languages that I know shift over time. It's kind of weird that we think of ourselves as being very linguistically static, or that at some point in our education, we learn a bunch of languages and then that's it. Like that's all we'll be able to learn in our lives. And, this is kind of true to some extent, but for many different reasons, displacement, migration, people have to pick up other languages. They have to also contend with the influence of other languages onto their own linguistic makeup as they move through life. And these are all very troubling things that can't be put into a text, especially for something that's being translated from one thing to another. And I suppose the other thing that I would want to add to this and to further complicate matters is also the existence of creoles, the existence of contact languages. So my book is a book that's written in Singlish, which is an English-based Creole made up of the multiple languages in Singapore and English. And I hesitate to call myself a translator. I'm just someone who's sort of trying to use translation as a mode of understanding and trying to trouble this idea that there must be some epistemological gap in translation in order for both languages to function as to communicate to one another. And creoles are interesting for me because like they're very oral, first of all, and they demonstrate so well the ongoingness of language. Creoles move very quickly, meanings shift over time, new words are introduced into the language. And how do you, first of all, would you translate something like that into, and what would you translate that into? And second of all, then is that really a language? And I suppose the other part of this is also that creoles are often they're more oral, more than textual. And so there's a struggle to kind of capture that into language, to fix that into a book that can then be circulated, commodified, and sold. So I'm just going to put a bunch of these things here and just let them permeate through the room, just as a way of troubling this idea of like, what does it mean when we translate, or how do you think of yourself? What does that mode of translation mean for you? Does it only mean sort of that movement between the source and target language, or are there other ways in which we can kind of trouble those boundaries? We can muddy the textures of what we're translating from one language to another.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, I think that what you just said about like, I don't really consider myself a translator, but translation is a mode of understanding. And that links back to what Madhu says at the beginning about multilingualism being the original state, or state of being is the original condition, state of being. So I did write it down. It links back to this thing. So if we do consider, if we're starting at a different point where multilingualism is the original experience, then how does that complicate our idea of translation, when originally we're thinking about translation as this very linear sort of A to B kind of process? And maybe that does mean that, you know, Hamid, that in that specific conceptualization of translation, then you aren't a translator, but then maybe you don't want to be that kind of translator, because the translation provides more. The translation is a mode that kind of can give way to so much more than what that particular process in that kind of clinical way can offer. And I was also going to say that please, to the audience, if you have, here we have one question. This is to Madhu. The ongoingness of language is fascinating, and I totally get it, but you talked about how language is fixed in your translating of a text. How do you incorporate that ongoingness of the language when you translate a book?
That's great. I think there's a couple of things that are coming to my mind. And first of all, I guess, one way of thinking about that is that it's not about one translation of one book. It's about, that's where it's like that translation is in conversation with other texts that are being translated, or further translations of the same text. And I think that's the thing about, I mean, it is completely inefficient and doesn't, a lot of my thoughts about translation, aren't necessarily workable in a market economy, but the idea that, that something can be like, have its boundary in a moment and say, this is what I'm doing with this text, and but that's not the final word, right? And so it's about one text being related to other texts. So I don't think all the work has to be in one translation. But I think that even within a translation, I mean, I think some of the questions that come up are going back to what Hamid said about creoles, and, that there are so many different registers of language, right? And so, what do we mean? What do I, and, there, in some ways we could say, take something like the French language, right? That I could say there is no such thing as the French language, right? Because there are the languages that kind of come together in a cloud that are called French, or even English, right? English is even more complicated because of its status as a global kind of language. But I think the recognition of that. So when I'm translating, I think there's also like, just to give an example from Telugu, again, I think that there is Telugu is a language that I'm very clear that I don't have mastery of, not only because of my immigrant status and, the fluency issues around that, but also because it's a language that varies from district to district within, like, in, relatively close quarters. It's people speak different versions of Telugu depending on caste, community. And so, for instance, there are certain texts of Telugu that have a lot of Urdu in them. There are texts that are more kind of high literary Telugu, which I personally don't even understand because it's so Sanskritized. And so I think that, when I'm working on translation, there's no single answer, but there's a lot of questions around how do I give a feeling of that texture, in the English. So I, and that includes English, right? English is an Indian language, but English is also inside a lot of the vernacular languages of India, right? And so, as opposed to thinking of English, so if I'm translating from Telugu to English, as opposed to just thinking of here's Telugu and here's English, thinking of like all the different textures in this language that actually have an overlap with English, because English is inside this other language, right? So I think that it's, a challenge, but thinking about how do you create that feeling of the multiplicity within the work. Yeah.
If I could add to what Madhu said, there's a book that came out quite recently by Ellen Jones on multilingualism in translation, and she brings examples of all the Americas, right? So she also brings examples from South America and Central America, and she talks about it being well, usually we think of a multilingual text as a text that is untranslatable because it offers these challenges. But she talks about multilingual texts they actually invite translation, because the translation of multilingual texts shows how the text has an unfinishable, unfinalizable status, and that's the openness and the always changing nature of a text. So multilingualism makes that, or the attempt at translating multilingualism, at making these things come to the surface, is an attempt of showing how open these texts actually are, and not only multilingual texts, but text in general. But like we're talking specifically about multilingualism in textual form, then that would be a big. I really like the way she puts it, because it's it does the text is it's never finished really. And there are retranslations to prove that. There's adaptations, there's like pastiche, there's many sorts of art forms that come from actually nothing is original, everything is changing, and the text is also not a final thing that cannot be changed. So multilingualism just makes this aspect more visible, I guess. That's at least how she puts it, and I find it's a nice way to see that as an inviting translation rather than being untranslatable.
I want to just add one thing to follow up on that, what Lucia just said. That goes back to the kind of unfinished quality, ongoing quality, which is also, I think, has to do with mastery again. And the idea that, especially if you're working with multilingualism within a text, that there was this kind of notion that, what the translator does is kind of like master everything that's in the text and then kind of bring it over. But if part of being in this like multilingual state is that we don't have mastery, that we have partial, like even if you're a so-called like native speaker, you have partial access to language. And so to me, it's like part of the work in the translation is leaving some of the opacities of a text in place. And that is the particular imprint that you as a translator would bring, and that someone else's translation would have different like places of, points of pressure, let's say.
I just wanted to add something brief to that as well. And I think oftentimes with translation, there's this expectation that the translator can accurately sort of like locate themselves in the text unambiguously. But with multilingual texts, it's very difficult because all of a sudden the languages, there are certain languages that you don't know. And then suddenly, what is this expectation as you as a translator to sort of try and access some of these things that are opaque to you as well? Multilingual texts, I feel, force you to understand where you are located in the world precisely, because the opacity of not being able to understand what's before you forces you to understand that you exist in space and time. You're not some universal whatever, that there's this unboundedness that can be very scary to know that there's only certain things that you understand and certain things that you don't understand. And then what do you do with that,
I think there's something about this ongoingness, this messiness, this within text, and this idea about positionality that also links to like the idea that no multilingual text, even if it has that same combination of languages, will ever, it's important to note that that's, if we're moving away from these language boundaries, then you can't cookie cutter like a trio of languages, or this text incorporates, this text is in Singlish, and assume that Singlish is going to be the same as another text that's written in Singlish. And I suppose some of the questions that are coming up here are linked to where did it go? Are linked to strategies around how to conceptualize those the source text in that sense. How do we think about them when we know that each one is going to be unique, both contextually, and has to be understood in its own way, and also how it's located in space and time. And I think there's this question here, which is, I'm working with a text that uses this ongoingness of language to write in the third space and deconstruct neocolonial relationships. One of the techniques is to use the source language incorrectly, e.g. wrong lexis. And so my question is, what would your strategies be to convey this incorrect source language into the target language, as someone who has only ever experienced the target language as an L1, and in a way that avoids fetishizing, patronizing, infantilizing the source texts?
I'll just say that's a wonderful, wonderful problem. In that, I think it really depends on, I think that's such a well-posed question, because it depends on the relationship of that original text, that language, to so for instance, if you're translating from French to English, then there's a different concern about that. But I think if you're translating from if there's like a colonial question there, that attention to not exoticizing or fetishizing that language is really interesting. But I'm thinking one of the things that's just immediately leaping to my mind is like Aimé Césaire's Notebook of a Return to the Native Land, and a kind of willingness to, he just moves between so many registers. And there's I think we have to be careful as translators, both to not want to fetishize or exoticize an original, and thinking about its relationship to maybe if you're translating, for instance, into English, thinking about those colonial and cultural relations. And at the same time, the answer to that is not to perform a certain kind of excellence that would meet the standard of, and so I think, I think it's I have a very kind of maybe vague answer, but I think it's really what, I think it's important in that kind of situation to really, to take the risk, of producing something that doesn't show up proper, right? And and I think that's what's inherent in the question is how do we take that risk without kind of buying into certain ideas of that original text, culture, language, but I think it's just a really, really kind of rich problem.
Lucia, Hamid, did you have any thoughts on that point?
I'm just going to comment on something I saw in the chat in response to what Madhu is saying and what the question asked. That is it depends sometimes as well to who we were translating for. So it also comes from this idea that translation has to be a service to people who do not speak the source language. Well, it's not always the case. You find also translations that are, for example, there's the translations of Harry Potter into Scots. And this is basically also an idea to have more things written and translated into Scots to strengthen that language, sure. But also it's an exercise for the translator to see how that would work in Scots. And a lot of times translation doesn't necessarily need to be for the monolingual reader. It can be for other translators. So it really would depend on the type of reader you have, and then that also will come if you have, depending on the publisher as well. So depending on what the kind of aims they have and what the reader they have in mind, then obviously these things would have to be different. Some of these ideas we are proposing might not work for specific types of publishing, if it's aimed at a specific public. I do believe that we need to be able to make people think and make people stop in their tracks and maybe do some more slow reading and get back to and challenge these ideas, this kind of comfort of reading something in your L1 and just thinking that the whole world speaks and writes like in your own. I think we need to challenge these, but at the same time, it always would depend on the reader that is intended and why you're doing that translation. I myself do a lot of translation. I've done a lot of translation as service, right, for people who do not read whatever language. But also I've do a lot of translation because it's for an exercise, linguistic exercise. Sometimes for fun. Sometimes it's just I want to. I don't know. There's many reasons to translate, and that would also depend on the reader you intend and the specific context. If it's like a publishing house, or if it's a journal, or if you're translating for other translators like yourself. So this would change the kind of strategies you have to employ when you're doing this, when you're translating something.
I don't think there's any right way of rendering an incorrect version of a language, if that makes any sense. A lot of it just has to do with trial and error, and it also has to do with being willing to sort of be vulnerable with how you understand the languages that you're using right now. Because I think the ways in which you depict an incorrect version of a source or target language has a lot to do with your own view of these depictions, which is just a roundabout way of saying that you kind of have to justify that particular version that you're rendering, and that there's no right way of doing it, and it's like a trial and error sort of thing. And it also, like everyone else has said, it really depends also on the relationship you have with your publisher, who's the book for, and stuff like that.
If I can add one more thing to that, because I think both Hamid and Lucia, your comments were, I think, really on point, in terms of all the, we're talking about something abstract, right? And all the all the specifics and the contingencies of the production of a translation really matter. But going back to the question of the wrong, language that's wrong or error, it's also, I think, just to kind of, it's helped me push my own thinking a little bit further, your comments, because it's there is stereotype error, right? And there's error that stops you, and that feels a little intransigent. And I imagine, it could be that the original text is playing with this, stereotype error, but there's also error that's difficult, that isn't just the ready-made kind of wrongness of language, that's, about class and, things like that. And so I think I think there's a rich kind of discovery to be made in the different kinds of being wrong, in what way is this text wrong in its language, right? And what does that mean, right? Of course, we're taking that, kind of lightly, that the idea of wrongness. And I think thinking about well, what is the way of being wrong? If that wrongness in the original is partly a challenge to dominant forms of language or standardized forms of language, how can we produce that, kind of extend that kind of challenge in the translation?
And this links neatly onto ideas around how we can, challenges that exists when confronted by sort of gatekeepers who impose ideas of rightness and wrongness. And so Isabella has asked, could you please talk a bit about the publishing industry, how the publishing industry deals with multilingualism today? We're told that we should translate into our native language, and I have the impression that fitting into the simplified definition of translation, source to target translation, is an obstacle to the career of emerging translators who are trying to reach publishers and get into the market, but don't fit into the standard official bilingualism.
Oh, that's a whole chapter of my thesis there for you. I'm not in publishing, so I cannot speak for people who work in publishing houses or editors or stuff. But I can tell from the people I interviewed for my thesis. So I interviewed people who translate into what would be considered their second language, but then there's problems with that, as I can see throughout the interviews, that a lot of them don't really know what there's no hierarchy or languages, L1, L2, L3. And a lot of them have really, really complex linguistic backgrounds. So it's not a straightforward answer, but a lot of them have come across these type of gatekeeping of saying you should translate into your first language. I think if we're talking about specifically into English, because it will change depending on into what language you're translating into. Sorry, I'm using too much into. If this sounds like a fever dream, it's because it probably is. I'm feverish. But basically, a lot of the times when the world starts taking, say English, and just it became a global language. There's all these different varieties of English. There's way more people speaking English as a second language than first language speakers. And so the Anglo monolinguals start losing ground, and that's not, they don't want to. You don't want to lose your language to the foreigners, the aliens, the people who come and steal your language and take somewhere else. That's how they see it. And then you kind of, you need, and this can be unconscious. That's not, does not mean that they are the baddies and they don't want to let others in, but it might be an unconscious kind of bias towards others who have the same experience as that. And then you need to, they feel that you need to find, say, for example, to come here to do this PhD, I had to pay 2,000 Brazilian reais to Cambridge. So they test me and tell me that my English is good enough to come do my PhD here. And why is Cambridge still the authority on telling people if they know English or not? And they gave me a certificate saying that I according to Cambridge standards, to UK English, Oxford standards, I could speak English, right? So, and actually that already expired last year. So I'm actually speaking English illegally. And that really gets me, because it's been centuries and they're still holding on to that power and deciding who gets to call English their first language, their L1, and that helps as well when you say, oh, you should only translate into your L1, because if the language in question is if the target language in question is English, then that means they get more jobs for themselves, because they get to translate into English. And I see a lot of people who are really good Anglo monolinguals, who are really good readers, have always been and are good writers as well, then now become super good, like well-known translators of, say, Latin American literature into English. And I'm not saying they're not good translators. I know some of them, they're my friends, they're great. But a lot of the times it's like us Latin Americans, sometimes we're like, yeah, but what about, why can't we translate our own literatures into English as well? Like, we know enough English to do this. But unconsciously, sometimes they're holding on to that, because if they fear if you don't gatekeep, the hordes are coming in and they're going to destroy our language. And if there's no Cambridge to say who speaks English and who doesn't, what will we do? And so the literary kind of establishment needs these structures, or they want these structures in place, and they might through these myths that actually are myths, and there are studies proving that the mother tongue is a problematic, not really applicable myth. The native speakerism is also a problem. Native speakers are not better users of the language than non-native speakers. There's proof of that. But still, even though there's proof and there's science proving them wrong, these myths are still there, and people still go and say, oh, you should ask an English native speaker to proofread this to see if it's good. And why to see if it's good? To see if it fits the expectations of the reader who doesn't want to be confronted with something that's from somewhere else. And that's just everywhere. And I don't know about Madhu, Gitanjali, and Hamid, if you had the same experience, but growing up in Brazil, I read translations all the time. And it was never like no one ever told me that book was written by a Brazilian author. I knew that book had been translated from whatever language. And I, as a kid, for example, when you translate for kids, people are very wary of, not being too foreignizing and whatever. But I, as a kid, I was fine with knowing that the rest of the world thought differently and wrote in a different language than I did. So I guess this kind of, I don't know, we're trying to protect someone. We don't exactly know who we're trying to protect. And there's a system in place that's trying to protect these readers from the world, from the attack of other languages and other users of English. And English has more of a problem in that. But you could talk about other languages and that the contexts are different. But that's what I learned in my thesis so far with English.
Lucia, that was so on point. I loved everything that you said, and I think that there's something that Lawrence has brought up in the questions that I think what's coming out is that it's quite difficult to talk about multilingualism without also establishing what the contrast is. So even as we're talking, we're using words such as mastery and fluency, and then by contrast, vulnerability, flexibility, ongoingness. And I think that there's something that's quite interesting about self-translation in this respect, because I suppose the translator is in the same location as the source and the target. And I think Lawrence's question will provide quite a good insight or angle to our discussion on multilingualism. And he says, I wonder if the panelists can address the issue of self-translation, especially with regards to global power dynamics, so minoritized languages, colonial history, etc., and how these interact or overlap with the creation process itself. Separately is the question of authors who write in multiple languages, not necessarily self-translation, but different original creative outputs in different languages. So two things there.
So I think I loved, Lucia, what you just said about needing to be protected from the certain kinds of uses of language. I just want to say, like, translation has given me everything. Like, it really, I'm an immigrant to the United States, and if I was stuck with things that existed only in the so-called like English language, like, just what a disaster life would be, and I'm just really aware of that. Like, my whole kind of coming of age and being is like the things that I was reading and consuming and kind of the way I was responding to the world is so much about things that kind of were moving in different ways. And so I think even the self that's being translated, like the self-translation, again, the self is already constructed with so many different influences. And the funny thing for me is the language that I studied the most from second grade through college was French. And then I studied Spanish and a little bit of Italian. And so I have these different languages that are not Indian languages. But the thing I think about French is, and I pardon, like, this is not about anyone else's language, but my experience of French is kind of like it was a toy language. Because, like, here I was, an immigrant, having just lost access to my native, first language, coming and learning this, really kind of being immersed in another language, English, and suddenly I'm learning this third language, which is just like what is that for? Like, what's the point of this like language that has nothing to do with anything, but someone is telling me that it's important? And so I think of kind of French, to me, in my life, French is like a useless toy language that I love. I love it because it has no use. And I say this because I know that it pricks in particular ways. I mean, you always want to stick it a little bit to the French, but so my sense of self includes all of that, includes this person who was like a Telugu speaker learning English and suddenly was faced with like being in French Catholic school, not my religion either. And I think the thing about self-translation is very similar to me. Like, so I think of translation as in the original writing I do. I want my original, right now I'm working on a book of nonfiction, and I want my writing to actually feel translated. I know that that's a thing that's considered like, we want things to not feel translated, right? Like, and actually like works that feel translated, that feel like there's something that's coming from somewhere else, even if it's coming from your backyard. And that is a voice and a register. And so for me, part of my own like immigrant aesthetic is to try to put things together that don't normally conventionally go together. And sometimes that's just like a little jaggedness in the voice, a little bit of elsewhere, a little bit of a slip where, I think of my writing as, I want it to be like mostly so-called competent. I mean, I really don't, I want it to be other than competent, but let's just say like, I want it to be like, competent prose, but I want it to then slip sometimes into these other registers and, of awkwardness, of, something that kind of just stops you. And I think that is actually fundamentally a relationship to the self, also of a self that is not, I don't want to act like I know myself and then my job as a writer is to translate my thoughts and feelings and self to the page, because there's also that part of oneself that one doesn't know, right? That doesn't feel fully formed and is opaque to oneself. And so I think all of that goes into, self-translation.
First of all, I'm very proud to be part of the horde of people who are invading the English language and ruining it. I take great joy in doing that. Secondly, I think, I don't know, the book that I wrote is weird because it's written in Singlish and English, but the English is completely opaque in some parts. So anyone who's sort of reading my book is going to be like, oh, I know English, let me try and read the English part. And they're going to find out they're not going to be able to understand it. And so like, what the hell am I actually translating? But I think what I was actually translating was the joy of my own opacity. I don't know, translation, I think my relationship to translation has always been a kind of extraction. I always feel like as if when someone is trying to translate out of the languages that I know, and maybe, my first language being Malay, that when someone is translating Malay literature into English, that there's some kind of extraction happening. There's some kind of totalizing gesture that happens that allows me to be seen. But then my question is always like, who's actually looking? Like, what is this gaze that is being performed on me? And that's kind of like how I approach translation. I am deeply suspicious of it, first of all. And so self-translation becomes to me like a way of like just troubling that, just making all of it fall apart. Just, this is opaque, this doesn't make sense. I'm even gonna construct my own register of Singlish so that when the people who know Singlish read it are gonna look at it and be like, what is this guy actually saying? And so what am I doing? I'm merely speaking to myself. And sometimes that's all we need to do. We just need to verbalize ourselves into being. And then we can figure out the business of what is it we want to communicate to the rest of the world. But first of all, let's try and find out what is this private language that we're able to speak to ourselves. And in a way that that is truthful of our location in the world, but also the difficulties we run up against when we meet other languages. Because that's also pretty individualistic, if you ask me. And so that's kind of like self-translation for me. And some of the more recent work that I'm doing right now is kind of like, okay, what are the other ways, what are these other private languages that I can come up with? And one of the things that I'm recently trying to work with now is Acemic Writing, And for those of you who don't know what acemic writing is kind of like handwriting that looks like writing but isn't. It looks like scribbles on the page, essentially. And one of the things that I've realized as I do that is, well, first of all, the gestures on the page, my handwriting, is based on the languages that I know how to write. Penmanship, right? The multiple ways in which the scripts we know and how we speak, all of that arrives on the page as gesture. What does that mean? How do you read that? Because like, I can't read it, neither can all of you. So then who am I actually writing for? Yeah, so these are just some of the ways in which I think of self-translation these days. Not so much in terms of like, oh, I have this language that I think emotionally in and this other language that I'm socialized into, that I'm educated into. No, I think that kind of pays short thrift to the emotions we have towards the languages that we know, and also to kind of make it seem like as if you spoke this first language in your life as a person, that all your emotions reside there. I don't think that's necessarily true as well.
That's everyone was asking what's the type of writing. Is acemic writing? Is that what you? Acemic.
Yes. I'll put that in the chat.
I would just say quickly, on self-translation, well, it's another can of worms that we don't want. I mean, it's a whole thing in and of itself. I would say that a lot of the times we think, even when we talk about multilingualism, even in studies of multilingualism, and people think of like multilingualism as meaning multiple monolingualisms, and that's not really. Well, it's even more multiple than that. If you think about it, like my housemate is Brazilian from another state, and I constantly have to translate myself because we don't get each other's, and it's not very far away from we're just states and we speak the same language, but we don't really. We have to translate each other all the time because there's this gap in the middle that we transpose, and we are just used to transposing it at this point. And it really depends on I feel it's a register thing as well. Like when I go back home, I have friends who are also English speakers. So I noticed that our texts and our thing are just code switching all the time between English and Portuguese. But then obviously when I go talk to my Brazilian family and the ones who don't speak English, I obviously have to adapt. And it takes me a while. So there's all these different little dialects that you speak with different people, depending on with my German family, it's a whole mixture of Portuguese, English, German, whatever else comes up. And then sometimes when the Germans come and visit, when our cousins come and visit, my grandma just mixes in Portuguese and talking to them. And they just I remember them looking at me going like, what is happening? And I just go with the flow. You understood from context, didn't you? And they're like, yeah. And it's like, yeah, just you shouldn't care that there's a Portuguese word in the middle of that German sentence. Just keep going. And then they got used to that. But a lot of the times it's just adapting to different things. And sometimes you have to translate yourself because in the interviews I conducted with with translators, a lot of them said that they had kind of different personalities in different languages. Some of them said that, well, when I speak English, I try to be a bit more like domesticated. Like I try to be a bit more like, because my way of speaking culturally, if I were to speak English in that way, I would be accused of being too assertive, too brash, whatever. So I have to kind of, so in depending on the language you speak, you also have to kind of change yourself a little bit. But then these languages, it might be even within one language or a language with a capital L, you might have to do these kind of switches and adapt these different registers, different idiolects, different dialects. And so self-translation is more common to us and more in everyday life than we think, I think.
I think Brazil is quite an interesting example because even though in Brazil there's over 200 indigenous languages, it largely conceives of itself as like a monolingual nation where like a lot of people will say that they speak Portuguese, even though there are minoritized languages in cities, et cetera, but more or less, yet it's such a huge country and the language varies so vastly. And I think that actually, complicates further this idea of multilingualism, monolingualism, because and highlights the constructed nature of both, because actually, you know, as you've just described, the experience of, you know, so-called monolingual speakers is very much similar to the experience of like multilingual speakers, in the sense that people are speaking different versions of the same language, yet the experience of it is as if people are speaking different languages, and there's this sort of translated nature of that. And so it sort of brings us back to this sort of complex and dynamic revisioning of these traditional notions of language and translation, where if we are conceiving of language as this fluid and dynamic entity rather than this bounded nature, it gives way for all of these different experiences that you've been describing so eloquently. And then with translation, I think I feel really moved by the way that you guys were all talking about self-translation, because I do think that in a way, you know, self-translation is also a state of being, in the sense that, you know, we have, and a few of you have touched on it, the idea of, you know, if you do exist with multiplicity, the forms that you can sort of describe yourself are almost a form of translation, where you're describing yourself as a more bounded version of yourself. I really related, Madhu, to what you were describing about your trajectory of sort of you know, losing or sort of having this, your first language or the Indian language taken away, and then learning these European languages at school, and you realize that I don't know, this idea that like the way that you conceive of yourself within these languages is also via the form that you've been that you learn. And I loved what you were saying, Hamid, about how your work really breaks through that. And I'm really thinking about, you know, how do we make space for not just multilingualism, but multilingual experience, which is encapsulated in multilingualism. And then what you said, Lucia, about multiple monolingualisms, I think that our reliance on bounded language, on the boundedness of language, lends us to think about multilingualism as multiple monolingualisms, in the sense that, you know, we'll have a text that is a mixture of Spanish and Portuguese and Guarani, and yet we'll think about all three of those as defined entities, and that they're all mixing, rather than thinking about a whole, which is things that you were discussing. So I
would just like to add to that quickly, that in a lot of places when you talk multilingualism, and I've come across this very often in my 4 years, my PhD here, is that people here in Britain assume that when I talk about multilingualism, it's being elitist, because of language, learning a second language in the UK, for example, is not very accessible. But they are also assuming that these second languages, these foreign languages, are one of the main European languages with a capital L, you know, and they forget the natural multilingualism of Great Britain before all of the colonizations that they forced upon the rest of the world, and the modern, the contemporary multilingualism of it, and that multilingualism is not elitist. And similarly in Brazil, for the longest time, we thought about ourselves as monolinguals, and we think, well, you need to learn English to be someone in life. We were always taught that you need to learn English or Spanish, but Spanish not much, but English especially to go further in life, to get a good job, etc. And then you add other European languages on top of that. So if you wanted to, I remember with my grandma growing up, I wanted to learn Guarani properly. And I bought her a grammar of Paraguayan Guarani. I was like, "Can you teach me?" So she taught me some stuff. And then my whole family, this Brazilian side, for example, would think of themselves as monolingual, because they don't think of, I don't know English well enough to put that in my CV and to speak those languages. But actually, their lived experience are like, we would mix in Guarani words in the middle of Portuguese. When my grandma wanted to say something bad about someone else that was in the group, she would speak to us in Guarani. So it became for us this little secret language. So nowadays, if I were to go to Paraguay, I would have a very old-fashioned, dated Guarani / Spanish / Portuguese that I only know the very problematic things to say in Guarani. So it's kind of this little but because we think of multilingualism as acquiring these big languages, these big European languages for to use somewhere. They need to be useful. Why would you learn this language if there's 100 speakers of it? And why wouldn't you take that's something you hear all the time. Why wouldn't you put your time to learn? When I was 12, I wanted to learn Mandarin, a Chinese Mandarin, and I went to a language school wanting to enroll, and the person there said, "Oh, this is only for businessmen over the age of 18," and I was 12, and I was like, I just wanted to learn Chinese. I was like, no, it's only if you're really gonna do any business with China. That's why you need to learn Chinese. Otherwise, why would a 12-year-old girl from Brazil want to learn Chinese? Makes no sense. So these ideas are also challenge the way that we see multilingualism. And if we see multilingualism as only this learning of separate bounded entities, language, especially European languages, and then obviously you could say, oh, this is elitist. But if you see multilingualism as being in everyone's lives and it's being more common than we think, then you see that actually we're more multilingual than we previously thought. So yeah, I just wanted to tell these anecdotes and just to to add to.
I just wanted to add to that, that I just think that you should curse in every language that you can curse in. That's the joy of cursing. And it feels different in different languages, right? But in terms of this, the idea of the elite versus the fact that many people across the world live in a multilingual kind of situation. I think that it's just, to me, going back to the usefulness of a language, a language that not very many people speak or whatever. I think that to me, this goes back a little bit to the question about publishing, and I can't really speak too much to publishing, but questions that how do we make interventions, right? And how do we navigate we have all these ideas, about the multilingual self and kind of evading boundaries, but then we're kind of dealing with some constraints of the publishing worlds that we actually have to deal with. And as someone who has actually edited translation and just recently edited a small folio of writing from less translated languages into English, and less translated languages are the maybe the less useful languages, but they're not only small languages. So when we think of it might be shifting, but Mandarin is considered a less translated language, right? A lot of the Indian languages are considered less translated, and so I think usefulness is also it's a political idea, right? I mean, as Lucia's comment showed, right? It's not real. There are many uses of language. And so I think, just my thought is just to encourage people to wherever you can within the constraints that you have, think about what interventions you can make, even if you can't bring across everything that you want to within a particular, situation.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to address some of the questions that have been going in the chat. So we have one that ties on after what you just said, Madhu, which is from Maddie, and she says, I recently translated a text for a uni project that included EU Spanish, Catalan and Berber. I only speak EU Spanish. It was a real challenge to come to terms with how to translate these terms, but I had them remain in the text as they were, providing more info with explanation. When doing a working project, how would any of you go about working through a situation like this? Would you keep the other language terms, find another translator to collaborate with just for that part? I always worry that I don't have first-hand experience of being native to these cultures. I can't fully appreciate their importance.
I'll just say really briefly, I think it's important to do your best to understand context, but I think the idea of that feeling of failure of not fully kind of understanding, I think you just work with where you are, so it's not can't answer to the specificity of that text, but I think it's to let go of the idea that you have to fully know everything. It doesn't mean you don't do your research and ask questions and really, work on it. But I think just kind of recognizing that you're translating from the perspective that from where you are, from the ground that you are in, and not from some kind of imaginary, like understanding all of these languages equally.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And usually the discomfort you're feeling is telling you something about how you should proceed with that project. And the answer isn't always to kind of to make that discomfort disappear. Sometimes it helps to make that discomfort very apparent on the page, however that might look like,
You might think of the metonymic gap that sometimes exophonic authors leave that on purpose. So you don't explain everything. You leave some stuff there, and the reader might want to go and check what it is and check a glossary somewhere and ask someone who knows, or you might just leave it for them to, because it all depends on what can be glossed over and what can't. But for example, I think of the translation by Julia Sanchez of Giovanni Martins, the book of short stories, Sun on My Head. The first short story in that book is full of Rio de Janeiro slang, carioca, specifically from the favelas. A lot of these words I didn't get, but a lot of them I do get. And I remember reading that in English, and she left a bunch of them without italics. She left them in the original, and the reader, as we say in Portuguese, leitor que lute, like you find your way, So sometimes that you can also, as Hamid said, you don't necessarily need to make that uncomfortableness, this uncomfortable feeling more comfortable. You can just leave it in that sense. So like, yes, this is it's other language that's coming to you, and you may not need from context. You may understand everything, but so I think of it as I think there's a poet, I forgot her name, who talks about this, like having a brook or a stream of water, and helping the reader to cross the brook by building a bridge, and the reader will cross the bridge and be okay. Or you give them a boat for them to cross themselves, or you maybe teach them to swim and just wait for them to cross, or they can just choose to stay on the other shore, and so it really depends on the reader, on the context and everything. But I guess sometimes leaving certain things as they are, it might sound like you're just being lazy. You just want to find someone who knew Berber to help you. But it might also be that that you just want to make the reader have the same kind of feeling that there's something different there that's coming to you directly. And the reader may choose to try to go further and, understand what that is, and just might just ignore it. And if they get it from context, they get it. But also, I think collaborative translation is not a thing that you should shun anyway. I think collaborations are always good in any case. But yeah, it would help in that case, I guess.
And just to close, a quick fire question. So we've got a question from Nauman. What would you say about source writers or their publishers who hold the rights, who want the translation to be smoothed over to sound like 19th century English canon, and would only work with translators who give them that, even when the source text itself is playing all sorts of tricks with language? I understand where their anxieties come from, and I think it needs to be addressed.
My thought is, whether you win the fight or not, fight, work, like think of it as a kind of navigation or negotiation, kind of push them and push their buttons. You might not get everything, but I think that to take that on is really important.
Yeah, annoy them. Reveal to them the world that they actually live in. I can't, like, I mean, the easier thing is to just say, I don't want to work with these people, but I think the project has to, we're not in that space anymore. That there is a certain refined sort of English that is only used for literature. I don't think that's, have it on a shirt to annoy them.
Okay, I think that will bring us to our close. Thank you so much to Madhu, Hamid, and Lucia for your incredible, insightful, thoughtful, thought-provoking comments and ideas. I hope that this has given lots of people food for thought. Thank you so much, BCLT, for having us. And thank you so much for such an active audience. Been loving all of your comments in the chat. And yeah, have a great afternoon. Bye.